It should always that I'm not working.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to welcome you here. This is a week of visits from old friends. So before I introduce Niral Shah, I want to remind everybody that there's a second Create Talk this week. Christy Morris and Thomas will be speaking at the same time, noon tomorrow, in the same place. She's a graduate of the SITE program in Department of Teacher Education, and she's currently a professional learning specialist with the Michigan Science Professional Learning Network, and she's going to be speaking about working with school districts and teachers' unions to pursue a new normal for science classroom teaching and learning. So, without further ado, I am honored to welcome Dr. Niral Shah back to MSU. He was a colleague in the Department of Teacher Education for 5 years before moving to the University of Washington, and he's collaborated and published with a number of faculty and students in both the Department of Teacher Education and the Department of Physics and Astronomy. At the University of Washington, Niral is an associate professor of learning sciences and human development, and he's the director of the Race Theory and Design Lab. His work has highlighted race, racism, and racial narratives in STEM education, and we'll hear more about that. And more broadly, he's interested in how people learn racism and anti-racism. And this is reflected in his work on a classroom observation tool designed to detect and mitigate implicit bias. It's called EQUIP, but not to be confused with the NGSS rubric. It's Equity, Quantified, and Participation. And personally, I've been really inspired by Niral's work on racial noticing for teachers, and I look forward to hearing his thoughts today about racism is permanent, so what's next for science education, or STEM education. Please join me in welcoming Niral to
Unmute the Zoom, hopefully that, where's my, good? On Zoom? Unmute? Okay, all right. Hello, everybody. It is very nice to be with you today. You know, as Alicia said, this is homecoming for me. And I'm having like this surreal sort of experience. It's like kind of like when you go back to your old high school. You know what I mean? It's like you walk the halls and you see a lot of the same faces, but it's like, you're not there anymore. You know, it's not sort of your place, you know, but it's nice to be back here. I'm especially grateful to the faculty and students and staff at Create who made this visit possible, for inviting me and for organizing the entire visit. I will say that one of the early dates that was proposed for me to come out was in February. And my first thought was, I'm like, you all know I used to live here, right? I'm like, Michigan in February, I'm like, maybe we'll try for April. And some of you know this story, but the last time I came out to Michigan in the winter from the West Coast was for my job talk, about 10 years ago. And I hit a polar vortex, this was back in 2014, remember that? And I almost didn't make it back in time for the birth of my first child. So this one's a little bit different, although I think I brought some bad weather today as well. From Seattle. So I also want to just thank everyone for taking the time to be here today. I know spring is always like the toughest part of the year, so I appreciate, especially some of the students I see here, I appreciate you. As well as, just dealing with all the ripple effects from the campus violence recently. And I just really appreciate your time today. So my talk today is titled Racism is Permanent. So what next for STEM education? I'm going to cover a lot of ground in this talk. And I know that there's a range in terms of how all of you, including in this room, but also on Zoom, how you come at questions of race and racism, both in general and how they relate to equity and justice in STEM education. So my hope today is that there's an idea or two that you can take away that pushes you in rethinking how you come at your own work. Many of you know me, but I'm just going to say a little bit about who I am, some of my background, because it's going to give some important context for the talk. I spent the last 20 years or so advocating for equity and justice in P-12 STEM education. My focus has been on race, racism, and anti-racism, which I understand to be intersectional phenomena. I've studied the racialized experiences of STEM students of color, how race and racism shape their opportunities to learn in classrooms, as well as their identities as students. And as Elisa mentioned, in my work with teachers, I've also designed tools and frameworks to support teachers to notice and mitigate inequity in classrooms. But before this part of my life, a constant was my love for STEM. So in high school, I was that kid with their TI-82 graphing calculator writing programs in BASIC. Any of those in here? They're not on the 82. Yeah. I went to college and got a degree in computer computer science. And when I became a high school math teacher, I taught every class from pre-algebra all the way to AP Calc BC. So I've been knee-deep in STEM for a very long time. And for a lot of my career, I focused on this question, which is how can we build racially equitable and just learning environments in STEM education? But there's another question that I've come to believe is even more important, and it looks in the opposite direction. How can we advance racial equity and justice in the world through STEM education? And this is the question that I'd like to focus on today. I'm going to reference several terms throughout this talk. So let me just briefly share how I'm defining them. And I'm just giving a gloss here. I could obviously give the whole talk just on this slide. So I define racism as systemic oppression of groups of people, usually predicated on interpretations of phenotype and an assumption of inherent and immutable inferiority. Racism intersects with and is compounded by other oppressive forms like patriarchy and ableism, and it operates structurally through policies and laws, as well as in the cultural domain through media and social interaction. I define racial justice as a rolling condition where material inequities are being redressed, such as in the form of a full reparations program. But it also involves the ontological, and by that I mean questions of personhood. Who gets to be seen as full human beings under the conditions of white supremacy? In that context, racial justice occurs when BIPOC communities experience recognition as full human beings alongside material redress. I define anti-racism as practices that both resist racism and that also build intersectional BIPOC community well-being. And last, this term STEM education is a contested term as well. In this talk, I'm going to use STEM education to at times refer to the set of disciplines that typically fall under the STEM umbrella, and as well as the discourses that comprise how we make sense of STEM and STEM learners. And as my colleague Macy Golson always reminds me, there isn't just one version of STEM education. Right? And many people in this room are in the business of trying to reimagine what STEM education can mean. In this talk, I'm really going to focus on dominant forms of STEM education, those that are most pervasive in US schools. So this talk has three parts. Theoretically, the ideas I present here are mainly rooted in Black studies, particularly the work of Derek Bell. So I'm going to start by discussing his theory of racial realism and the idea that racism is permanent. Next, I'll appraise current approaches to anti-racism in STEM education. And I'm going to use racial realism to analyze both their potential as well as their limitations to affect racial justice. In the last part of the talk, I'm going to turn to what I think we can actually do as a field to reduce harm for BIPOC communities. Specifically, I'll suggest new ways to design for things like teacher education based on racial realism. And I'm also going to argue that strategic divestments from STEM education, in other words, less STEM education, would have a positive structural impact towards racial justice. As you listen to my talk today, I think it'll help to understand how I organize my priorities. What matters to me is the well-being of the roughly 100 million BIPOC living in the United States, and certainly around the world too, but for the sake of today's talk, I'm going to focus on the US. While I still find STEM fascinating, if an alien were to come down tomorrow and told me that we could have racial justice immediately, in exchange for all of the good things that STEM has produced, I'd take that trade in a second. I didn't always feel that way, right? For a long time, I would have hesitated. I would have worried about what we as a society would lose in that trade, but my priorities have changed. And I hope today that by explaining how and why those priorities changed, it will at least provoke some new questions for you in how you consider taking up some of these issues in your own work. Okay, so let's talk about Derek Bell. So some of you might have passing familiarity with who he was, but you might not know some of the particulars of his story. He's now best known as a legal scholar, but he started his career working at the DOJ in the 1950s, and he actually left the DOJ after they asked him to resign his membership in the NAACP. Okay. So remember, this is around the time of Brown versus Board in '54. And so instead of doing that, Bell decided to leave the DOJ, and he ended up taking a job with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund as a lawyer. Okay? And his main focus there was on school desegregation cases, right? So he has a particular connection to our work in education. He was in the thick of the Black Civil Rights movement. In the early 70s, Bell became the first Black tenured professor at Harvard Law School. And alongside Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Cheryl Harris, Mary Matsuda, Neil Gotanda, and many other legal scholars of color, Bell's ideas contributed to what became known as critical race theory. But Bell was also a speculative fiction writer, and in parallel to his legal scholarship, he wrote fiction that showcased the counter-storytelling methodology that's become a staple of CRT work. Now, Bell wrote extensively about concepts like interest convergence, which some of you might be familiar with. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on his notion of racial realism. And at the heart of racial realism is the idea that anti-Black racism is permanent. As Bell put it, Black people will never gain full equality in this country. Even those Herculean efforts we hail as successful will produce no more than temporary peaks of progress, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. He says this is a hard-to-accept fact that all history verifies. We must acknowledge it and move on to adopt policies based on what he called racial realism. This mindset or philosophy requires us to acknowledge the permanence of our subordinate status. Now, I want to underscore here just how strong a claim Bell is making. Often in CRT discourse, you see the idea that racism is endemic in the US, that it's baked into what the US was at its birth, and that it continues to structure US life broadly. Now, as a factual matter, I believe that's fairly true. But Bell is saying something more than that here. Not only is racism endemic, but he's saying that no matter what we do, although we can mitigate racism, we won't be able to eradicate it. I know many people who believe that racism is endemic, but they have a harder time wrapping their heads around the idea that racism is permanent. So I want to distinguish between these two ideas. I think it's important to really underscore this point. I once gave a talk where an audience member claimed that Bell meant that racism is permanent only until we change the structures of racism. That is not what Bell is saying based on my reading of his work. He was saying that racism is permanent, full stop. Now, in proposing racial realism, Bell was noticing how the law leaves so much room for interpretation for lawyers and judges. In practice, the legal system can always be deployed to support racist ends. Because of that, Bell concluded that the legal system can't actually be on net a meaningful engine for racial progress in the long run. Now, this amounted to a direct rebuke of what's been called the progress narrative. This idea that despite some setbacks, we continue to make progress towards racial justice and should just stay the course with incremental progress. As Richard Delgado and many others have pointed out, the progress narrative is incredibly valuable, particularly to white people, while being damaging to BIPOC. So as Delgado explained, if, however, the white person can say to himself or herself that the situation of African Americans is improving, and that the gap between the well-being of that group and mine is closing, then a sense of fault and responsibility reduces to manageable proportions. Any sense of urgency abates. All we need to do is wait. Now, I want to just sit on this idea for a second. And I want to put these two perspectives, racial realism and the progress narrative, next to each other, just so we can think about them for a minute. If we represented these two perspectives mathematically, and I'm simplifying here, it's always a dangerous thing to show graphs to a room full of STEM educators. But I think you'll see I'm just trying to make a point. So on the one hand, you have the progress narrative, where despite some ups and downs, the first derivative is mostly positive. And societal conditions for BIPOC are thought to be generally improving as we approach racial justice over time. On the other hand, you have the racial realist perspective, where societal conditions for BIPOC are essentially asymptotic. Occasional progress is repeatedly met with retaliation, and in the long run, society will tend to default to a racist posture. In formulating racial realism, Bell was accounting for how racist systems tend to reconfigure in response to anti-racist pushes, right? And certainly we've seen that in the last couple of years with post-George Floyd. So that old battles become new battles, just in slightly different form. And the work of racial justice becomes endlessly cyclical. This is the same dynamic that Du Bois described in his History of Reconstruction after the Civil War. Today we can compare current black unemployment rates to those in the 1970s, and we find that there's still basically double white unemployment rates. I now live in Seattle, and I also used to live in the Bay Area for a long time. Now, these are two of the most racially progressive places in certain ways in the entire country. If you've ever tried to be part of a coalition to end a gifted program in one of these places, I don't think there's a clear example of racial realism in education. Now, defenders of the progress narrative might argue that things are clearly better today than they were during slavery, right, or during Jim Crow, and they'd be right? That's undeniable. But even if you think that things are better now than they were 200 years ago or 100 years ago for black people, you have to then ask, what year exactly will anti-blackness actually end for good? Right? When will that happen? Or as the fantasy and speculative fiction writer N.K. Jemisin puts it, how long till Black Future Month? Even within the frame of the progress narrative, the timescales we're talking about start approaching hundreds of years, even millennia. At that point, while racism isn't technically permanent, it might as well be. Or as I'll argue later, those timescales for change should have a significant influence on how we pursue anti-racist struggle. So all of this might be feeling a little bleak. And I'm gonna, later in the talk, I'm gonna get to the hope part a little later. But as my colleague Danny Martin has said for years, I think in our field, we tend to jump to solutions a bit too quickly, rather than first really sitting with the depth and the scope of problems of racism. So before I get there, I'd like to next apply the frame of racial realism specifically to the context of STEM education, asking what does the permanence of racism mean for anti-racist efforts in STEM education. So there are a few main ways our field has pursued anti-racism over the years, and I'll say that across my career, I've pursued all of these in different ways. So my critique is also a critique of my own career. What I'd like to do is spend time talking through each approach, both what they bias in terms of racial justice, and also why I believe none of these approaches can ultimately help us actually attain racial justice, and at worst, how they might actually make things worse. So one approach to anti-racism in STEM education has been to seek proportional representation of BIPOC in STEM. So from AP physics classes to college math majors to BIPOC engineers and scientists in the STEM workforce. But if tomorrow we woke up and suddenly all BIPOC groups were proportionally represented across STEM fields, would that be racial justice? A dominant narrative in this country has been the false idea of the so-called American dream. Like that, I think a lot of the anti-racist work that we do in STEM ed implicitly runs on what we might call the STEM education dream. It's this idea that if we could just get enough BIPOC students and BIPOC professionals into STEM, that two things might happen. One, that access to higher paying STEM jobs will uplift economic prospects in BIPOC communities. And two, that having more BIPOC in STEM fields will change those fields themselves in fundamental ways. That maybe, for example, big tech will start producing less racist things. Now, I've come to believe that both of these aspects of the STEM education dream are myths, and I'd like to focus on the case of computing education for a moment to illustrate why I think that. So I recently co-authored a paper with Aman Yadav for a special issue upcoming in Tech Trends, which is co-edited with Michael Epstein. Aman and I started at MSU in 2014 at the same time. We met at the first faculty orientation. And over the years, we have gone back and forth. We don't agree on everything. we've gone back and forth debating sort of like, the different strategies in computing ed, that we and others have pursued, in the goal, setting goals of racial justice. So this particular paper is a little different. It's written actually as a dialogue between us. Like I said, we don't agree on everything, but one place we found significant agreement lately is on this point about the limitations of proportional representation as a racial justice goal. So one of the things we talk about in the paper is the actual economic impact of getting more BIPOC into STEM fields for BIPOC communities. Now, anyone in computing ed knows that the history of this, the push for computing education, has been a bipartisan effort for years now. And one example I'd like to share is from Vakil's work. Vakil documented a story of how back in 2014, when Jesse Jackson partnered with Intel Corporation, and he went to Oakland, and he was talking to a group of students. And what he said to them was that their goal should be to work for Microsoft, that their goal should be to work for Intel, their goal should be to work for Google. And I have no doubt that his intentions were good in saying that. But I think it's an example of just the ways what we call computing creep has sort of advanced, right, through education. All of the narratives around things like computer science for all, or the idea that everyone needs to learn how to code. These are, staples now of this discourse. From Amazon to President Obama, everyone pushing these narratives have been fairly explicit that learning computing is now crucial for economic access. And I think the subtext for BIPOC has been that participating in computing will mean general uplift for BIPOC communities as a whole. But here's the thing, under that strategy, how many BIPOC might actually get to work at one of these elite tech companies? Best case scenario is you might get a small slice of BIPOC, individuals, access to these lucrative STEM jobs. But here's the thing. Number one, that does little for the millions of other BIPOC who realistically will never get access to these jobs. And number two, this assumes that those jobs are still going to be there in the future. For any of us, for BIPOC or for white people, right? At a time when these same tech companies are teaching AI systems to write code, I'm like, what are we talking about here, right? I mean, the whole point of it, right, is to reduce labor costs as close to zero as possible. You might know the speculative fiction writer Ted Chiang. He wrote a story that was adapted into the movie Arrival from a few years ago. It had Amy Adams in it. Well, in his latest short story collection, he has a story. It's only a couple pages long, but it's one of my favorites. It's about a future where, it's an AI-driven future, where the role of human scientists has completely changed. Rather than spending our time producing new science, what human scientists do in this future is they spend their entire careers trying to make sense of the science that AI produced 20 years ago. The AI is so beyond human scientific understanding that there's just no point anymore for human scientists to try to produce new scientific knowledge. Now, this is a story, okay? But I think it's plausible that in some STEM fields, maybe all of them, we could be heading to some version of that future. My point being that I'm not confident there's a lot of STEM jobs out there for us in the future of the kinds that have been promised. So the point is this, right? Well, it's certainly a moral good that BIPOC should have equitable access to computing and other STEM fields. Broadening participation in STEM is not a jobs program for BIPOC communities writ large. Narratives like computing for all are good for tech companies because they increase the talent pool for them to pick from. But it doesn't produce racial justice in terms of economics at the community level for BIPOC. Now let me come back to the second part of the STEM education dream. The hope that a critical mass of BIPOC working in STEM institutions can actually reorient STEM itself towards racially just practices and goals. So let's take computing education again as an example. There are many amazing computing educators right now around the country. Some of you are in this room. Building critical, justice-focused versions of computing education. Now let's say a few thousand P12 BIPOC students every year head to college with not only an interest in computing, but also combined with a strong justice orientation, right? That's like sort of a best-case scenario for us. They've read Ruha Benjamin, they know the harms computing can cause and continues to cause, and they have a desire to repurpose computing towards just ends. what options realistically do they have in the computing workforce? What we've seen with tech companies is that although they might make limited investments in racial diversity programs, for example, those investments are usually just big enough to bolster their brand image, but never big enough to actually make a real difference in who works there or in how those companies run. Occasionally you see BIPOC climb the ranks at a place like Google or Meta, but we know where that usually leads. Right? If you're a critically oriented STEM worker who speaks up, there's a non-zero chance you're getting fired. And we just saw this recently with Dr. Timnit Gebru, a top AI ethics researcher and black woman, who in 2020 Google fired after she tried to publish a co-authored paper questioning the underlying architecture of large language models. And LLMs, you might know, constitute the basis for most of the cutting-edge AI that's getting released to the public, things like ChatGPT. So saying there's something wrong with the technology, potentially, that is about to play an increasing role in Google's profits was an obvious threat to the company. It's kind of like in Game of Thrones, where they take the enemy's head on a stake and they put it outside the gates of the city. Right? The message here was very clear. Right? It's fine to be a critical STEM researcher just as long as it doesn't threaten company profits. And I have to say that although this bothers me personally, I wasn't surprised at all. Google doesn't exist to produce racial justice. Right? That's not why they exist. Right? They're a corporation. They exist to produce profit. That's always going to be the #1 priority. So I never look to institutions like that, and there are others too, to be at the vanguard of racial justice work. That's just not what they're there for. To me, the goal isn't to have BIPOC running these institutions. Equity and justice doesn't automatically live inside the bodies of BIPOC individuals, right? That's its own kind of essentialist politics, which is problematic. One question I'd like to ask is, for example, is having a Native woman succeeding Mark Zuckerberg one day really what we want? Or would it be a better world if Facebook or Meta simply didn't exist? Individuals do matter, but I don't see a scenario where the institutions with the most power would let critically oriented leaders rise to a place where they could significantly change the institutions towards a justice agenda. Hopping up a level, my point is this, that although we should pursue proportional racial representation in STEM as a moral matter, under a permanent white supremacy, we should not imagine that it will make a significant impact on racial justice broadly. A second approach to anti-racism in STEM ed has been to focus on building BIPOC students' identities as STEM learners, to organize STEM learning environments so that BIPOC students see themselves and are seen by classmates and teachers as capable of doing and possibly even changing STEM. Now, I think there's at least two ways to think about the rationale for this approach. One rationale is based on the ethics of education, right? That every learner, even if they're not interested in the subject, should feel at least like they're capable of learning it, right? And to me, that makes a lot of sense, right? To me, that's a legitimate rationale. The issue, though, is that we usually don't stop there. A more common rationale for focusing on identity follows an instrumental perspective, which is that in addition to this ethical motivation, the main reason to focus on BIPOC students' STEM identities is because it supports STEM learning, right, and their access to STEM. And I think the issue there is that just leads us back into the representation that I just discussed. There's actually another limitation that comes with narrow ways of thinking about STEM identities, and it has to do with the relationship between positive STEM identities and racial justice. In math education, you might know that Danny Martin was the first scholar to coin the term mathematics identity in the context of his early work with African-American mathematics learners. His research has been a major influence, not only in my work, but I would argue in STEM education's growing emphasis in recent years in pursuing questions of identity. In a monograph on identity research in math education that I co-edited with Jenny Langer-Asuna, and which several at MSU, some here, contributed to this monograph, we invited Danny to write a commentary. And in his commentary, Danny revisits his early work from 20 plus years ago. And looking back, it turns out that he's a lot more skeptical of the net utility of his original call for the field to focus on questions of identity. And what he worries about is that identity research has become the latest vehicle for racial capitalism, where researchers profit by publishing research on the identities of black children, but without a clear political analysis. such that the full realities of black mathematics learners' lives remain obscure. It's a rich and provocative commentary. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I suggest you check it out. But today I want us to think about just one story that Danny focuses on in the commentary. So in it, he recalls the murder in 2019 of a black man named Botham Jean, who was killed by a white Dallas police officer, who mistook Jean's home for her own, and then shot Jean thinking that he was an intruder. And the detail Danny points out is that Botham Jean was an accountant at PricewaterhouseCoopers. So he was obviously strong in mathematics, and presumably he had a strong mathematics identity as well. And I just want to share what Danny wrote about this in the commentary. So what he asks is, but did it really matter to the white officer or to the state that he might have a positive mathematics identity? Is a positive mathematics identity, which is often the destination for much of the existing research, enough to counterbalance white supremacy, anti-blackness, and state disregard for black life? For me, what Danny is asking us to think about resonates with the frame that I offered at the beginning of this talk, which is what is the relationship between anti-racism and STEM ed? How it can't just be about producing racial equity or racial justice within STEM, but that STEM education and STEM must facilitate racial justice in the world beyond STEM. If we in STEM ed aren't prioritizing that, I think we're missing the point of what really matters. The last major approach to anti-racism I'll mention for now is the discourse around humanizing STEM ed. So you might be familiar with Rochelle Gutierrez and her colleagues in math education, who have called for rehumanizing math education. And their focus is on particular racialized groups, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students. Now this question about the relationship between race, STEM, and personhood was was something that I focused on really early in my work, back when I was in grad school even. And what I've argued is that perceptions of intelligence serve as a nexus point between race and STEM. So on the one hand, racism has always been about dividing people into groups based on perceptions of things like mental capacity, where white people are constantly positioned as intellectually superior to BIPOC. And this goes back 400 years to Kant, Hume, and other so-called Enlightenment scholars. On the other hand, the same can be said of STEM subjects, right? Where people think you're smart in general if you can do a math problem, or if you can write computer code. Now, based on this theory and empirical work, the conclusion I reached was that doing well in STEM could be a route to humanization for BIPOC. That if BIPOC students could prove their intellectual capacity by doing well in STEM, that this could contribute to them being recognized as full human beings. But in recent years and in conversation with racial realism, I've become more ambivalent about this conclusion. One of the things that started to change my thinking was when I started to analyze how Asian people get racialized through discourses of STEM. So this false and racist narrative about Asian people's supposed mathematical superiority, it's pervasive, right? It's a global narrative. And not only does it imply the mathematical inferiority of non-Asians of color, but what I've argued is that it also dehumanizes Asian people across geographies and histories of cultural practice. So through the gaze of STEM education, Asian people are seen as technically proficient, but not creative. They're seen as smart, but lacking problem-solving ability. In the end, Asians are objectified as kinds of human calculators. The reason this insight was important for me is that it showed me the limits of BIPOC success in STEM as a pathway to humanization. Being seen as good at math might have material benefits for some Asian people, right, in the form of access to lucrative STEM jobs, but it also comes at a very high ontological cost. Asians reached the mountaintop, so to speak, on perceived intelligence, and it turned Asian people into robots, or into androids. So this led me to a new conclusion. Depending on your racial positionality, maybe STEM success can be somewhat humanizing in relation to the white gaze, but only to a point. If STEM success didn't work in the end for Asian people, why should we expect it to work for any other BIPOC group currently more marginalized in STEM? Okay, so if racism is permanent, and the main ways we're currently pursuing racial justice aren't going to work in the end, what should we do? Is there anything we can do? The good news is I think the answer is yes. So I'm going to close the talk by talking about some of those things. One, I think, misinterpretation of Derek Bell. If you look at his writing, I think he was deeply frustrated about this for the remainder of his career. But I think he was constantly writing about how when he says race isn't permanent, it's not a call to give up. And for him, an honest assessment of Black civil rights history was really an impetus to change strategy, and that's how I come at it as well. So racial realism wasn't just about a more honest social analysis, right? He saw it as a first step towards the possibility of a truer freedom for Black people. He was arguing for the liberatory potential of the permanence of racism. Now, liberation can come in many forms, but in the context of STEM education, I think the best we can do is to try to reduce harm for BIPOC communities. So in the last part here, I'm going to discuss two specific approaches to harm reduction. Okay, so the first is what I call racial realist design. So what do I mean by that? By racial realist design, what I mean is designing with the permanence of racism, right? So accounting for the fact that racism is always going to be with us. Now, one analogy I find useful here, it relates to climate change. So I'm assuming everyone buys into climate change here. Now, let's say that you're an architect, okay? And you've been tasked to design a public park for a city. Right? And you're thinking about climate change, and there's at least maybe two broad approaches you could take. One approach, on the left, is to design a giant seawall to protect the park, and maybe to build an entire seawall around the whole city. Right? So that's one approach. Another approach is to, on the right, to design under the assumption that your park will flood. So this is a picture of a space called the Water Plaza in Rotterdam. And that's a city that mostly sits below sea level. So the architects that designed that space built it under the assumption that the water will come. So this water plaza is designed to be enjoyed in certain ways when it's dry, and then in other ways when it floods. The design doesn't pretend that the water can be stopped, but accepts the reality of climate change. This is what I'm suggesting, that our designs for racial equity and for racial justice should start from a clear-eyed acceptance of the depth and permanence of racism. I believe that using racial realism as a starting point should cause us to design anti-racist educational programs and initiatives in very different ways. And so to kind of exemplify that, I want to apply this idea to education. And I know that many of you are connected to STEM teacher ed in different ways. So I'm going to give an example of racial realist design in the context of some of the work I've done in teacher ed. So a lot of that work has revolved mainly around a web app called Equip, which I built with Dan Reinholtz, who's at San Diego State. I know not everyone might be familiar with this tool, so I'll just say briefly that what Equip is, it's a classroom observation tool that generates quantitative analytics on participation patterns in classrooms. So the idea is that if teachers got access to data on who's participating and who's not, how they're participating, and if that data were broken down by intersectional social markers, that teachers could use that data to attenuate how their biases are playing out in the classroom. Okay, so that's sort of the spirit and goal of Equip. Now, it's quite common in race-focused teacher education to engage white teachers in reckoning with things like white privilege, right? Or teaching them about concepts like color evasiveness, or teaching them histories of racial oppression that maybe they didn't know. And the hope being that if they learn about these ideas, that it'll translate into changes into their practice. Right? When we use Equip with teachers, we don't do any of that, or at least not at first. When we support teachers in debriefing on their Equip data and then brainstorming changes to practice, sometimes months will go by before any of those kinds of conversations come up, and sometimes they never come up. But that's a deliberate design decision, based on an acceptance that intersectional racial ideologies are extremely difficult to change. This is based on overwhelming evidence in the teacher ed literature, going back to Christine Sleater's work 30 years ago. And even if we can change teachers' racial ideologies even a little bit, that's at least a decades-long learning process. Right? Like think about in your own life, right? Wherever you're at, whatever your positionality is, how long it took you to learn whatever you know now, right? And do now in your life around anti-racism, right? Very long-term learning process. And that's usually a lot more time than we usually have with teachers. At best, the best case I've ever heard is like working with the same group for maybe a few years. But usually it's like we have a month with them, or maybe a set of 5 PDs in a row over the course of a year or something like that. So rather than trying to get them to change their hearts and minds, so to speak, and then move the needle on practice. We actually flip that and then start with practice. It's about attempting to triage or reduce the harm caused to BIPOC kids in terms of the kinds of participation opportunities they're getting. Now, we found that conversations about things like white privilege do seem to organically arise when we're talking with teachers about equity patterns and participation. We've had teachers, who've been teaching for 25 years who suddenly, see some data and they ask themselves, oh, do you think I could be biased, right? Or, some of the work that Beth and I did. We've had teachers, veteran teachers, ask questions about how they, mediate the participation of Latina girls in their class and how they connect that to how their mother socialized them to think about gender when they were growing up as a little girl in rural Michigan, right? So there's just amazing things that come out from this analysis of the data, but it's never guaranteed. The point is that we're designing our PD with the permanence of racism by accepting a particular compromise, that the moral and material benefit that comes from triaging inequitable teaching practice outweighs the cost-benefit calculation of trying to make fundamental changes to teachers' entire racial ideologies in a very short period of time. The second thing I want to mention that I think we can do operates at a more structural level and focuses on the P-12 curriculum. I believe that one of the most impactful ways to reduce harm to BIPOC communities would be strategic divestments of STEM education in P-12. In other words, I'm proposing less STEM education would get us closer to racial justice. Now, I recognize that that's a really crazy thing to say to a room full of STEM educators. So there's a couple dimensions to my thinking on this, so I'm going to unpack those, and then we can also talk about the Q&A. So the P-12 curriculum is essentially zero-sum, because there are only so many instructional days in a year, and hours in a day. This means that the more space some subjects take up, the less there is for others. In that sense, more STEM imposes an opportunity cost on the rest of the curriculum. Now, many of us have deep personal and professional investments in STEM, so it's natural to first think about what might be lost with less STEM. But I just want you to pause for a moment and consider what might be gained. In short, I'm arguing that less STEM in P-12 would open space for curricula that more directly advance racial justice. Some of you know that I've got two kids. I've got a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old, and they go to Seattle Public Schools. And when they come home, they tell me, Dad, here's what we did today, or I ask them. And I think about what I'd like them to learn, before they graduate, And they're just in kindergarten and 3rd grade right now. And what comes to mind for me, my hope, is I want them to be able to take multiple courses on the politics of indigenous sovereignty. I want them to take a class on how the global supply chain works and how it's made possible through exploitation of people in the global south. And I'd want them to have a deep dive on Reconstruction, a strong understanding of Black radical politics historically. In my opinion, this kind of education stands a better chance of moving the needle on BIPOC humanization at scale. I believe we need to organize a public education that creates the conditions for people en masse to learn the importance of pro-Black policies like reparations and pro-Indigenous policies like rectifying the theft of Indigenous lands and waters. This should be our top priority. Instead of CS for all, what we need is ethnic studies for all. But right now, even if there were public demand and political will for such courses, there just isn't room in the current curriculum for them in most schools. Let me say a little bit more about what I mean by strategic divestments. So first I want to be clear that by less STEM education, I don't mean no STEM education. STEM, I still believe, is very important, and it needs to be part of P-12 education. Second, I don't see this as a blanket policy, right? So what I mean by strategic is that we should be thoughtful about where we make cuts in STEM. For instance, science has been wiped out of the elementary curriculum in most schools. In my view, we don't need less science ed there, right? It's also the case that based on historical resource disparities, the amount of STEM education already looks really differently in white dominant context compared with Black dominant context, right? So there's nuance here in how we think about this. I also believe that we should revisit the amount of STEM that's currently compulsory in P-12. Currently in many states, 10 to 11 full years of mathematics are required at minimum to qualify for a college or university. Can this be reduced? Can we also rethink and reduce how much instructional time is devoted to STEM at each grade level? Does it have to be a full year every year? next big STEM candidate for becoming compulsory in P-12 education is computing education. A number of states have already passed computer science graduation requirements. And with all the money flowing in from the federal government, as well as from tech companies, I believe this is a trend that's only going to continue over time. We should ask what costs a policy like that will impose on the rest of the curriculum, and whether those changes are in the best interest of racial justice. Finally, we need to distinguish between students learning about STEM and students learning to do STEM. So in the case of computing, my sense is that we don't need every P-12 student to learn how to implement machine learning algorithms. What we do want, though, is for every student to be able to follow at least a podcast about AI and what's happening right now with AI. To understand how computing is affecting their world, its potential benefits and its potential harms. Being strategic about the kind of STEM education that's actually necessary for a better, more informed citizenry can also check against how much space STEM education occupies in the curriculum. Now, I used to think this was a false choice. In my career, I participated in a number of projects that have tried to integrate these concerns, racial justice and STEM education. I also know many excellent scholars and educators building anti-racist forms of STEM education, again, some of you in the room. In my experience, this is incredibly challenging work to pull off, and a lot easier in theory than in practice. But here's the thing, even when we can pull it off, it's almost always done in small pockets, right? An after-school program, right? So some kind of pilot program. I have yet to see this kind of curriculum allowed to be implemented at the scale of, for example, an entire high school science program. For the same reason Timnit Gebru was fired by Google, I don't think this will ever be allowed in American public schools. I don't even think it's what most American parents want, white or BIPOC. So I started this talk by saying that, personally, I've always loved STEM, and still do. What really matters to me now is racial justice. And the question I've been asking myself is, do we actually need STEM to pursue an intersectional racial justice? And the answer I've come to is that we don't. The largest and most sustained movements for justice in human history happened long before social media, or the internet, or even the personal computer. But the natural thing for any professional to do is to advocate for the continued growth of their field. So it makes sense that we'd want more and more STEM education because that's what we know, it's what we love. But we shouldn't want more STEM just because it brings us joy, or that we hope we can get kids to find it as fascinating as we found it. We should want STEM when it leads to less voter suppression and police brutality in Black communities. We should want STEM when it produces a society that chooses to return native land. And we should want STEM when it pushes back against the growth of American militarism and empire. Where STEM is better placed than other disciplines to advance those societal goals, I believe we should have it. But where it isn't, I believe we should refuse it. Thank you. I don't know if I'm running questions, or are you someone monitoring Zoom as well? I don't want this question. Okay, let's open it.
Well, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
I just didn't want to dominate. Can you go back several slides?
Sure.
I'll
Which
tell you when to stop. It's before you keep going. I'll tell you when. I don't know which one it was.
I know there's a way to select the
somewhere
slide.
in there, I totally agree with your focus that we have to do more with social justice. Anybody alive today, as far as I'm concerned, that doesn't realize that, like, wake up, right? I mean, it's, so I agree with all that. What I don't understand, and I'd like your input, is why focus on STEM education? Why not history? Why not social studies? Why not the whole educational system, right? I mean, I don't understand your comment on let's decrease STEM. Why isn't it the whole educational system, right? That's what it seems to me would be the issue. That's, I just like your comments on that.
Well, yeah, thanks, Cheryl. And I also recognize it's not easy to ask questions after a talk like that, so I appreciate you sharing your opinion. I think the short answer is because I'm talking to a group of STEM educators. On the slide where I talked about the zero-sumness of the curriculum, that's exactly, I agree with you, which is that we need stronger and more history education, for example, right? We need to grow the humanities.
Right, and go ahead, I don't know what that. It seems like we have a more integrated approach, and maybe the school systems will never do that. And maybe you're right, because we're STEM educators, we can do something about it. And that's why we're focusing on STEM, but it seems like it's a much larger, I don't know.
Well, and
I
maybe,
haven't studied this area, so.
well, and that's what I was going to say. It could be that, you've just been central in STEM education for so long that, in outside STEM education, these are conversations being had, always being had, right? And I think part of the challenge in non-STEM fields is the way that all of the dollars flowing into STEM, right? And for all the reasons it happens, it basically crowds out some of my favorite colleagues in education are social studies educators. And I talk to them, and oftentimes, they have to find creative ways to get funding for what they're doing. And this, there was a nice paper written that, about sort of the history of STEAM and how STEM came to be and STEAM came to be. And it was fascinating to me, I didn't know the history of how the A got into STEM, which was basically arts educators realizing that, there's no money there, right? It's going to be dried up. So if they're going to get funding for anything, they've got to, latch onto the STEM bandwagon. So that racial justice work has always been happening outside STEM. And I think STEM is sort of newer to it, but I think that discourse is growing. But that's the reason why I'm making the point about STEM ed, because I think we're early in this work, right? Whereas others have been doing it for some time.
Okay, I asked a question, others can ask a question.
I mentioned you before you got here. But thanks for driving all the way.
Yeah, through the rain, I want you to know.
I know.
It'll be a beer at some point. I think maybe if I'm understanding the question, I think there's a tension between creating racial justice inside of STEM education and STEM education as a vehicle towards a greater societal racial justice. And so I think those are two distinct things. And I'm wondering, do you feel like that's getting conflated in this talk a little bit? That's a question, legit.
Were you here when I showed the slides, Dan?
No.
Oh, yeah. I had, I'll just put it up so you can see it. But yeah, no, I think disambiguating those things is exactly important.
But I have another question too, because I feel like there's also a move that you're making here where work inside of STEM education is being atomized around individuals. And I think if there's the possibility of collective action, could those first three approaches that you named, positive STEM identities that are then a part of a form of collective action and a set of politics, actually do make a move on a gauge in terms of racial justice within STEM? Okay.
Yeah. Did folks in the back hear the question? A little bit? What I hear Macy pushing on is, the sort of the three main ways I described how anti-racism work gets done, you can just correct me. If we were to pursue that kind of work in a more collective way, could it actually have a bigger impact, right? And could we be a little more optimistic that I'm calling for about that work? Is that what you think about that?
And
Yeah.
pulling on folks like Bob Moses, who was using mathematics to make that kind of collective action, realize that kind of collective action.
Yeah.
That was his vision.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
in some ways this is a critique
It is.
of him as well.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
I know. Yeah. Treading a lot of dangerous things.
Okay.
Sometimes you just gotta go for it. I guess the question that comes to mind for me about collective is how big is the collective, right? Because, going back to one of my early slides, to me, it's not enough to move some elite segment of a BIPOC group forward. How is what we're doing in STEM ed around anti-racism, for example, what does that mean for the 100 million BIPOC in this country? And so collective action, I think, any kind of work at any scale, I think that's going to have any impact. It's got to be collective in some way. But what I'm skeptical about is sort of the scale of collective that we can garner, right? And that's where racial realism comes to the fore. I mean, I look at gifted programs, right, back to that example, which is, we've known, like, going back to Jeannie Oakes, you know, like almost 40 years ago now, we've known the problems with gifted programs, right? So there's nothing to really reimagine there, like, we just need to get rid of the gifted program. And it's basically impossible to do in places like Seattle. And that tells me that, like, there's a lot of, you know, people of color and white people advocating for the dismantling of the tracking program in Seattle public schools. And yet it's still not enough. And, you know, it's in a weird way, my wife just told me this story of a parent that she got to know a little bit at our kid's school. Their kid a white parent didn't get, their kid didn't get accepted to the gifted program by like the testing procedure or whatever. And the parent was so upset about this that she called the district office gifted program every day for a month. Every day for a month until they just got fed up and they put the kid in the gifted program. Wow. And so what that tells me is that even if you have a large collective action, like the way the system works is that it doesn't take many powerful people to push back even against collective action, which is the source of my skepticism. But I know what you mean. Yeah, question.
I was wondering if you could talk, so I heard you say one of the paths that you're suggesting is the triage and mitigate rather than focusing on changing hearts and minds. And I'm wondering if, and that's a really super attractive, I'm a scientist, super attractive, right? Let's focus on the problem and triage that and work on that. But I'm wondering about if you could say a little bit about the people who are supporting folks and learning to triage and mitigate. Do those hearts and minds need to be changed first?
Teacher educators.
Yeah, the people who are running the programs, if you will. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, you know, I didn't get a chance to share my new research, which I've been doing since moving to University of Washington the last 2 years. But my team has been analyzing for the last few years memoirs written by anti-racist activists. That's our new data set, and we've been basically trying to theorize how people learn anti-racism over long timescales. And I sort of alluded to the timescale problem of anti-racism learning in the talk, but that's come very clear when you read people's memoirs, and this is both white activists as well as BIPOC activists. Right? People like Grace Lee Boggs, Asada Shakur, Mav Segrist, anti-Klan organizer. And one thing you find is that these are people who are basically at the cutting edge of how we think about anti-racist practice. And yet, if you read their memoirs, the learning process was like, you know, decade, 2 decades, right? And it's still ongoing, right? So with like even like teacher educators, right? So I used to, you know, be a teacher educator in the program, right? And I looked around at the program, and even for myself, I mean, how I did a teacher ed class back in 2015 would be really different than how I do it now, right? So I've learned too, right? And so, but even for myself, I think it's sort of the same problem, which is you can't, you know, one of the grad seminars I teach at UW is applying learning theory to how people learn anti-racism. And one thing I tell my grad students is basically you can never change someone's mind about something like race through a conversation, right? Or sharing facts, right? Or you can, but a lot of sort of foundation has to be laid, and it's a very long-term process. And I think it's also true for teacher educators. And so, and that's one of our dilemmas as a field, which I don't have an answer to, which is that we get the students for a short amount of time, but the teacher educators, we also like, you know, don't have all the time in the world. So like, how do you move teacher educators along at the same time while they're trying to move their students along, right? Teacher candidates. It's a very hard problem. But I mean, the short answer to your question is yes. I'm not sure if you had thoughts about it, if we could dialogue. No?
I think my question was coming from so when can you step into that? Like if you're teaching graduate students, right, who are imagining themselves going on and doing these other things, what are their markers that like, okay, my heart and mind is in a place where I can start doing mitigation without doing harm, right? Those kinds of questions.
Well, you know, maybe an analogy that might be useful is like with the Equip, for example, when we use that with teachers. We'd never do it with a teacher that's not ready to use it, right? It just doesn't, it's not going to produce results because they're not ready. I think similarly with teacher educators, I mean, I think that, you know, one thing I've been thinking a lot about, which is, how do you actually move people towards, stronger forms of anti-racist practice? And I think one of the hardest things for people that keeps them stuck in place is they're not willing to give up things that they think they need for either their kids or for their family. And it's another way of describing sort of just, the obstinacy of privilege. Right? But I think we need to put harder asks to people and see what they say. So, and I think it requires a certain kind of boldness. I'm not saying this is a vetted scientific solution, but I'm just saying that, even personally in my life, I found that instead of sort of tiptoeing around certain things, if you want to really push somebody, I think you've got to ask them how do you feel about reparations, and then let them talk, and then have that conversation over the course of 8 years. Because I think that the timescales of our expectations have to be extended. I guess is my point, and it's frustrating.
Yeah, really wonderful talk, and I feel like a structure of your talk as dialectical. You're saying, let's get rid of it, right? There's this conflict, and I see a critique you're making where racial justice in STEM is too often assimilationist, right? It's too easy just to take shallow identity politics and incorporate it into capital and do business as usual. And so I'm thinking about that, the fact that your talk had this kind of dialectical nature, the fact that Du Bois, was a Marxist, Derek Bell comes out of a Marxist tradition, explicitly talks about the dialectic. I'm wondering, should we shift to thinking more about class and STEM? And because it seemed like that was an implicit conversation. You talked about the global capitalist supply chain.
Yeah.
You put Du Bois' wonderful Marxist analysis of Reconstruction up there. I'm wondering, would it be harder to assimilate arguments for having class representation within STEM fields? Looking to folks like the Black Revolutionary League in Detroit, who were arguing automation's not bad, we just need to control automation, right? Is there a way, if it's not class, is there another way to get that, to make sure that STEM is part of the conflict to resist the assimilationist strategy that we're seeing from, a lack of a better term, woke capital, that I think is implicit within your critique?
Yeah. Are you thinking about it? We've had conversations a little bit in the past. I think you're not, but you don't mean this in sort of an either or strategic way, do you? Sort of like race or class, or
No, certainly not. That's and that's kind of why I was pointing to Du Bois and Bell as
I mean, to a point. I mean, I think I circle back to my point that how I define racial justice isn't just the material. And I think, it has to be attention to the material and ontological. And one thing, this talk originally was about an hour, 5 minutes, but I cut a lot. And the other part I didn't get to mention today, I think there's also a spiritual dimension to when we talk about, something like liberation. That's not a word I use very often. I'm very careful about a particular word. But just to say about sort of, when we talk about racial justice and the material dimension of racial justice, that alone is not liberation, right? So if we had, class equality, right, across racial markers tomorrow, that wouldn't solve, right, those other dimensions. And so that's why I say to a point, right, which is I think Zeus Leonardo, for example, I know in one of his previous papers, he tried to push the term race class as one word, right, to give attention to the fact that these are intertwined, right? So yeah, I think that it maybe could move the needle, in certain directions on aspects of the problem. But I think the question around humanization, right, and that's not disconnected from, disenfranchisement in capitalist society and so on, right? But I think that the forefronting of a racial frame, I think also forefronts that ontological dimension. And so we just have to be careful about which part of the problem we're attending to. So think about it.
Yeah, and it also brings up this issue of putting the idea that education is going to change systems, right?
Yeah.
If we need to, it's almost a trickle down, for lack of a better term.
Yes.
It just seems like it'd be a lot harder. Black Amazon worker organizer Chris Smalls It would be a lot harder to assimilate his demands
Right.
into Amazon than it would for them just to say, oh, we're gonna choose a black CEO to put on the board,
Right.
or a black shareholder to put on the board.
Yeah, and that's exactly what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's and it gets, I think, circles back to your point about like, you know, who controls the means of production and all
Yeah.
that stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Great to see you.
Good to see you.
Inspiring talk. I was still waiting, I wanted a little bit more hope on the end, so I was gonna add a couple more minutes, but that's okay. I think my question is around, well, one, I just wanted to say thank you because now, I think I'm more clear-eyed than I was before about like where the projects that I'm currently working on lie and to what extent they can be helpful. And so thank you for like really pushing that. And my question is around the divestment in STEM. In some ways, for some reason in my mind, I heard like something parallel to like defund the police. Was some of that kind of like in your thinking when you were?
Oh boy. Yeah, no, I just say that because, you know, in some ways, you know, Seattle is one of those places that sort of, you know, defund is very strong discourse in Seattle, and watching that fall apart there is, I'm following that. Say more, Missy. Like, what were you thinking? I might have been thinking.
Well, so for me, I was thinking that, and then, geez, I just thought of another question too. But for me, I was thinking it was in the minimized harm bit. So I was thinking divestment in STEM would be, in some ways, minimizing the harm that BIPOC folks experience in STEM environments. And the same thing with like defunding the police and replacing it with other things that would minimize. That's what I was thinking.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think so. Yeah, that's I appreciate the nuance. So, so I think what you said is I didn't exactly name that, but I think that's a part of my motivation to push that claim. But actually, I think it's more like if you take the defund analogy further, it's the second part of what you just said, which is that, you know, it's the community services that we would be funding, right? It's the zero-sumness, right? And we can debate whether you agree it's zero-sum, right? I believe it is. But that's in the context of P12 STEM and just the general P12 curriculum, it's the second part that's what it means to me, which is that, to me, if more, for example, white kids were learning like proper history, like proper Black history, rather than, you know, lukewarm versions of MLK, I think we'd end up shifting public opinion maybe like 30, 40, 50 years down the road, maybe 200 years down the road, to create the conditions to actually pass a proper reparations policy, for example. And so, yeah, I think, you know, your work, you know, other people's work, like we've documented the, you know, the harms that happen to BIPOC in STEM spaces. And so it would reduce that. But to me, it's more about what we would gain on the other side that would, you know, eventually mitigate greater harm. So that's how I was thinking.
I have a second question about it.
Yeah.
So you mentioned towards the end of your talk how have less focus on STEM so we can make room for other areas like history or racial issues. How would you grapple with the question that, in my experience, every scholar thinks that their research interest needs to be focused more on an education? So like, even though these issues are important, someone might say, no, we need to focus more on coding because it's helping this thing, or focus more on English, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
How would you grapple with that? Because I don't think it's realistic to like have everything taught in education.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's part of the big tension here, right? Which is, and that's why, you know, I put that slide up just clarifying what my priorities are, you know, which is, you know, I mean, everyone generally wants their priorities to be everyone else's priorities. You know, I'm no different, you know. But I think that's really what we're often arguing about, actually, you know, which is, and I think that's why it's sort of the easy way out to say, well, both and. Of course, I want racial justice. Of course, I care about, you know, racial equity, and I want STEM education. Why can't we have both? And I think that's a way of, you know, kind of getting out of that priority question. But in my experience, all the way down from running PDs to seeing how like teacher ed programs are structured, what I've seen is that choices are always being made, right? So even if like you say that like I equally prioritize these things, in my opinion, that's never true. And so, you know, that's a values debate, right? And we can have that debate, but I actually think we're not as explicit about that conversation about what do we actually prioritize, right? I mean, in this talk, I put my foot out there, and say like, yeah, I used to feel this way, but now my priorities are this way, right? And I think part of my motivation is to like encourage that type of conversation. But yeah, I think you nailed it. That's at the core of all of this.
Thank you so much for your talk. So towards the end, you said something to the effect of, as much as we might want to invest in STEM education because it brings joy, we should only invest in STEM education when it advances racial justice. And so I guess I was wondering about your thoughts on why we can't have STEM education just because it brings joy, and like education that brings joy as humanizing.
Yeah. Did everyone hear the question? Okay. I think one example of my issue with sort of the prioritization of joy is I don't want to mischaracterize how you were framing it. Is that how you were asking? Why can't we, have a STEM education as centers?
Why isn't it enough for education just to bring joy? Like
Yeah.
that's a way of humanizing.
Yeah. I guess like the counterexample in my mind is what's happening with AI right now. The people building AI, and I'm sort of obsessive about this, so I've been like listening to a lot of interviews and reading all the articles about like just kind of not only like the technology, but also like the people building it and why they're doing it, right? The number one reason I always hear is because for them it's an interesting puzzle to solve. It's fun, it's interesting, it's challenging, it stretches them intellectually, right? And then second, they'll talk about things like protein folding, right? Or sort of like the potential advances for biotech, right? Which are legit, right? Like, like reducing human suffering and so on. And to me, it's problematic to have that be your number one goal without at least equal regard, if not prioritizing the potential harm of the thing you're building. And so in STEM ed, I think that we don't often hold ourselves accountable for what comes out on the other end of STEM education, right? So like I have a business background. So like before I became a high school teacher, I was in business school, right? And so a lot of my friends, like still today from those days, they like have their own hedge funds and they're in private equity. So I know that world really well. And I know for a fact that things like the Great Recession, right, in 2008, and the meltdown of the banks, that wouldn't have been possible without a lot of people with STEM degrees, right? Now that's not the only reason that happened, right? But it's not just people from business school going and building high-frequency trading algorithms, for example, right? Or complex models, right? And so I think we can't control that, right? We can't control what someone taking our 11th grade physics class does 5 years later. But we have to look at that and say, well, AI is happening here, and we're talking about more computing in P12 schools over here, right? So they're not completely disconnected. And so if you're building an education only based on sort of students' joy, are they liking it, are they finding it interesting, right? To me, that sort of is a little too narrow, right? And you have to, at the same time, think carefully, like, yeah, they might like this, but could this destroy humanity, for example, in the case of computing? Like, I've been freaked out by some of the survey data. They surveyed a bunch of AI researchers recently in the field. People actually the cutting edge of building and stuff, and I think it was something like, I'm gonna get this, I'm not gonna butcher this stat, but it was something like either 10% of the people surveyed said that there was a non-zero chance that the thing they were working on could destroy humanity one day, or the average was there was a 10% chance that all the people surveyed gave to the thing they're building would destroy humanity one day. And if you listen to Ezra Klein and his podcast, he asked the question, if I told you that what you do for a living has a 10% chance of destroying humanity, you'd probably stop what you're doing, right? And that's not what's happening in the AI world. So that's sort of the example that comes to mind that worries me.
So one of the things that I heard you saying was that some of us are doing really cool work around combining racial justice with STEM education, but this is happening at such a very small scale, and it's really hard to scale that up, and it's not going to spread, to large scale. And then I think the thing you presented at the end is like, okay, let's reprioritize or decrease the amount of STEM stuff that we teach and more non-STEM stuff. And especially, I really liked how you suggested, classes about indigenous justice and capitalism and stuff like that. I think that's really great. But I also think that, like, white supremacy will never allow it to happen as on like a large scale. So I'm wondering about like how could, like why don't you think that we could scale up the combining racial justice and STEM and like taking critical perspectives in STEM education? You feel like that's not the way to go, but and it's more the way that we should go is fundamentally restructuring.
Yeah,
the curriculum.
Oh, yeah, thanks, yeah, good question. You want to add? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just like,
Oh.
that was part of the, thank you for articulating the question I had earlier.
No, no,
That's what I was trying to get at.
No, I think you were getting at it. I'm always good at interpreting questions, so I apologize. Yeah, thanks for that. So, actually, I think there's sort of a 1A and 1B to what you were saying just now. So one question I heard is just like, why do I think we can't actually scale some of those pilot programs, right? The cutting edge stuff. The short answer is that it's for the same reason we can't end a gifted program. Like to me, a gifted program is like not even close to an AI, like a critically focused AI education kind of module even, let alone like a whole curriculum. And my thinking is, we can't even do that, right? There's so much pushback against that. Why do we think we can do this? And so that's the short answer to that. And I'm interested in pushback on that. But the second thing that I think was sort of embedded in what you were saying, which I'm really happy to talk about, which is like, if both things, right? Like multiple classes, like my kid's taking multiple classes on the politics of indigenous sovereignty before they graduate Seattle Public Schools. If that's as equally unlikely as the scale up of like small scale critical STEM, right? Then why do that, right? It's equally, And I guess my feeling on it is like, if racism is permanent, then let's just work on like, put all our energy behind like the absolute biggest, most potentially impactful structural solutions, right? Like I didn't even get a chance to talk today about how, to me, a lot of our work I think is constrained by the 14th Amendment, right? The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, right? So if you read the history of how the 14th Amendment was formed coming out of Reconstruction, there was a version of the 14th Amendment that was specific to the protection of black rights. Right? I mean, that was the point coming off the Civil War and slavery. And there was that debate that the radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens, they lost, right? And what we ended up with was this watered down for all version of the 14th Amendment. Now, how I connect that to what we're doing is that, even at the university level, like if I want to have a program that specifically says it's for black and indigenous students, right? I can't actually name it that. I've got to do all these other workarounds, right? Maybe going through class or like, using some fuzzy language, right? Why can't I do that, right? Because it's in violation of Washington state law, where I live, and also federal law, right? In the sense that it violates the Equal Protection Clause and we'll get sued, right? So I guess the place where I've arrived is there's so much energy and goodwill of people working on these things at small scale. And I guess the point where I've come to is like, where can we put our energy? If something is equally unlikely to happen, how do we put it into a place that's going to have the potentially largest structural impact, right? And I think we don't have those conversations. Like, Bill Tate in math education, he gave a talk a few years ago, and he was talking about, he's in math education, he was talking about Medicaid expansion under Obamacare, right? And how there are a number of states that refuse to take that money for Medicaid expansion, right? And so he was connecting that to the fact that in math education for years we've talked about the need to engage all children in so-called high cognitive demand tests. And he was like, if kids come to school hungry and they don't have the food, right, the proper nutrition, the healthcare to be able to engage in high cognitive demand tests, how I understood what he was saying is that Medicaid expansion is a kind of structural math education racial justice initiative in a way, right? And I don't think we sort of connect those dots, and I include myself in this, I'm sort of newer to this perspective, but so yeah, in short, I feel like we just need to like look bigger picture, right,
Yeah.
in terms of the problems we're working on.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and I think like I do agree that we should aim bigger. But one other thing I was thinking about for scaling up like the pilot study kind of things is like I used to be an Amy Post student at UW, and like she's doing this work right now with like some of the teacher education folks with
Yep.
like kind of trying to increase like criticality in like the future of future K-12 CS educators. So I'm wondering if like the way that I see it is like the key to all of this is like teacher education and like changing changing the minds of like teachers to integrate, you know, the criticality and racial justice throughout the curriculum. And I do also agree that, like, to a certain extent with the decreasing STEM stuff, but like, I think that it's, anyway.
Yeah, it's not either or.
But at the same time, those students are gonna go into the tech industry, which doesn't care about racial justice, they care about profits. It's not gonna matter.
So you're saying that if we teach criticality,
It's not gonna matter when they go to the tech industry. Because the tech industry doesn't care about.
but see, come on. One of the things that I really wanted to draw this distinction on is that I don't believe we should be teaching people to go into computer science for people who go into the tech industry. I believe that K-12 CS education should be for all students to understand the impact of technology on society, right? Like, I'm not trying to change the minds of the people who are going into the tech industry. I'm trying to make people aware, to wake up to the potential harms, right?
Yeah, no, we're just smiling because this is exactly like a debate we had for
Yeah, you should read our
for a
paper.
long time.
I obviously read the paper.
Yeah, you've read that, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think we're out of time.
Okay. Thank you so much.